Okay, and this is the continuation of the series Echoes of Tragedy, Major Racial Massacres in Post-Emancipation America. For the three-part series of the Political Education for Freedom podcast. And let's get into it. So, we begin with the New Orleans Massacre. It's the NO again. I think I talked about the NO before. And was that an education podcast? I think that was the education one. Now, this was an eruption of violence stemming from deep-seated racial tensions and opposition to Reconstruction efforts. Now, remember for the part about the psychological effects, we talked about the different eras. Now, right after the Civil War, that era is considered Reconstruction era, and that's the time when America was trying to integrate formerly enslaved into society. I don't want to say white society because they were not trying to integrate them into white society. They were just trying to integrate them into society. There wasn't any laws specifically against segregating black and white communities. But like I said before, there was obviously formerly enslaved people didn't run to the area where their former masters and other white people that terrorized them. They wasn't going to where they were. They were leaving and going into other places. They would settle in different places, some of the worst places. Soil could be bad. Could have been, riddled with anything that you could think of in a wild. I mean, maybe the most rural parts of town. I mean, anything. They were just going away. They was getting the hell away. And so the government started at, some efforts to reconstruct this fractured nation. And it was fractured. Most civil wars, that it's not good for either side. And so that's what we call the Reconstruction era. And now the New Orleans Massacre, this unfolded against a backdrop of intense racial and political tensions during the early years. It happened on July 30th, 1866, when a black suffrage march organized by African Americans and radical Republicans. And remember, back then, the Republicans were against slavery, and the Southern Democrats were for slavery. Basically, the South were Democrats and the North were Republicans. that shifted, of course, in the 60s, and that it stayed that way for, I mean, at least 100 years, right? This was 1866. The 1960s is when the Southern Democrats switched parties and went to the Republican Party. Now, before, of course, we know we didn't have a side. Both sides was oppressing us. If you were from the South, you were a Republican. If you were from the North, you were a Democrat. And those Democrats from the South, they were considered Dixiecrats. Now, remember, the Dixiecrats, this was the side of the Confederacy. This was the Confederates. The Republicans were the Union. That was Lincoln. Remember the Republican Party of Lincoln. And so they were marching, and they were met with violence from a mob of ex-Confederates. And guess what that mob consists of? These were Confederates, right? But guess where they were now? Because it's no longer, the Confederacy doesn't exist anymore, right? Guess what they were? Police officers, firemen. Remember, they're all in the same community, and police officers is supposed to, be upholding the law, protecting and serving, quote unquote. I forget when the use of that term kind of upticked, because that was not the purpose of police officers. But you have police officers, and remember I said, right, after the Civil War, Lincoln could have done something about those Confederates, those ex-Confederates. He could have jailed them. He could have kicked them out the country. He could have took their citizenships. Hell, send their ass to Mexico. He could have done a lot, but guess what he did? And his predecessor, he just amped it up on 1,000. But he let them basically control or continue to control the South. And they become police officers and firemen. Now, you're a fireman. You're supposed to be putting out fires. Why the hell are you starting massacres or even being a part of mobs, for that matter? Now, the purpose of the march was to support a new Louisiana Constitutional Convention. And that Constitutional Convention was aimed at granting voting rights and civil liberties to freedmen. As the marchers convened outside the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans, they were confronted by opponents who viewed the empowerment of African Americans as a direct threat to social order. The confrontation quickly escalated into a full-blown massacre as the largely unarmed marchers were attacked. Over the course of the day, the violence spread throughout the city. By the end, official reports counted nearly 38 dead and over 100 wounded. But the actual numbers were likely much higher, especially among the Black community. Of course, we know that. The majority of the victims, of course, were African American. And the brutality of the attack was a demonstration of the resistance to Reconstruction and racial equality. Now, Lincoln knew this. Lincoln knew that even though the South was defeated, technically. He knew that they was putting up resistance. He knew that they wasn't just finna take it and lie down. But because Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist who didn't care about black people, he allowed these people to just go about galloping, just go about, the community as if, it wasn't, no big deal, right? Now, the reason for the Constitutional Convention was the state legislature enacting black codes. And we actually are going to talk about black codes in I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of black codes in one of the other massacres that we'll talk about. So just remember, they were protesting against black codes. And some people may know what black codes is, some people not. It's like this is 8th grade history. Some of y'all ain't took it in 30 years, 20 years, whatever. It's a part of the Reconstruction period that's discussed or that's taught in 8th grade. So they were protesting black codes. Now, the parade of marchers had basically thwarted off the mob on the other side of Canal. And if you've been to New Orleans during Mardi Gras or Bayou Classics, Canal Street. Now, I don't know where exactly the Mechanics Institute is. I think that's something that'd be worth looking at. I haven't looked at a map, so I'm pretty sure I would know that area once I look at it on the map. But they thwarted them off on the other side of Canal. But once they made it to the Mechanics Institute, which is where the convention was, because the convention was taking place inside the Mechanics Institute. And so they basically was met with more violence by a gang of white supremacists and ex-Confederates, which was made up of some policemen and firemen. But here's where it got worse. Fire sirens went off, and that signaled the police to attack. Here's some of I believe this was some of because the massacre was investigated, there was some reports circulated in newspaper and government documents. Of course, we know ultimately no one was punished or largely went unpunished. But here's what some of those papers said. There was panic because the police and firemen armed surrounding that building and began advancing. The attack was premeditated, led Police Chief Harry T. Hayes. What he was doing at the time was recruiting policemen from Confederate veterans. They stormed in and started shooting, chasing people down the street. And this was what circulated in some of those news reports. Now, remember, we're in the South, right? And remember, I was talking about how the Confederacy, or how the Union should have punished the Confederates. But of course, they didn't punish them, right? What they do? They gave them jobs. They gave them jobs. They gave them their jobs back. One of those jobs they gave back was the former mayor